Darragh, welcome. Welcome to today's talk, Ireland Should Be Free, with Liz Gillis, Darragh Gannon, and chaired by Mike Ritchie. The event is part of this year's special online Féile and Phobail, virtual Féile, brought to you by Féile and Phobail in partnership with St Mary's University College and the Irish News. The quotation is from Marcus Garvey in 1920, Ireland should be free. So the title of this talk is really about international perspectives on the Irish Revolution. It will explore these international reactions to the world's first anti-colonial revolution and will examine the influence of on other anti-imperial struggles around the world. Who was inspired by what was happening in Ireland? Who else internationally was struggling against colonialism, imperialism at the time? So our two speakers are from the Liberties in Dublin, Liz Gillis, a historian and author of 6 books about the Irish Revolution, 1913 to 1923, and Dr. Darragh Gannon, AHRC Fellow at Queen's University Belfast and ICUF Beacon Fellow at the University of Toronto. The chair is Mike Ritchie from Relatives for Justice in Belfast. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to everyone concerned and I will drop out.
Thanks very much, Bill, and look forward to this discussion on international reactions to the Irish Revolution. It's interesting, like that period of Irish history has gone through various iterations. I think it was even called the Troubles at one stage, and then it became the War of Independence, the Tan War, and now the preferred term seems to be the Irish Revolution more and more. So it'll be interesting to hear the perspectives of our two speakers. Darragh, I believe you're going to go first. Would you like to give us your input, and then we'll go to Liz Gillis. Thanks very much.
No problem. Thanks so much, Mike, for that very kind introduction. I mean, so many thanks to those who have prepared for today's event. I'd like to thank Joanna McGinn and Claire Hackett for the invitation to speak with you today. Congratulations again to Kevin Gamble, the director of Féile and Phobail, for a fantastic programme. And thanks to Bill Ralston for again coordinating this particular session. I'm really delighted to be with you. Of course, I prefer to be with you in person, but this is a great opportunity to kind of think about some of the most important events of 100 years ago within the framework of imperialism and anti-colonialism, subjects or terms which I think have become very current, not only in historical analysis, but also ideas about decolonization, public memory, collective memory, and so on. I'm very mindful of the words of the late Keith Jeffrey in his seminal study, Aspects of Ireland and the British Empire, when he said that, quote, much academic writing about Ireland, its history and its culture is dominated by the vocabulary of imperialism, unquote. And in the next 2 or 3 minutes in my opening statement, I'd like to somehow unpack ideas about this vocabulary of imperialism, and we'll hopefully develop those points in the course of discussion. So there are 3 key areas which I think might helpfully or most profitably frame our understanding of the Irish Revolution and its relationship with imperialism or colonialism. And those are comparative approaches, secondly, transnational approaches, and thirdly, an international approach. And I'd like to kind of detail each of those in turn. In terms of comparative approaches, we can consider the period after the First World War a second age of revolutions. And there are essentially contemporaneously to Ireland revolutions or rebellions or uprisings taking place across the globe. And many of those are perceived to have taken place against imperial rule. So, for example, in Eastern Europe, you have Ukraine. They are perceived uprising against Soviet rule or Bolshevik rule, and others besides, Egyptian, Indian, and so on. But in the case of comparison, I think it's useful to think about the example of Marcus Garvey, which was outlined at the very outset. Because Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, saw Ireland, or revolutionary Ireland, as a paradigm by which the lives of African Americans and people of color could be improved, which could advocate for African nationalism more broadly. And again, to go back to this idea of vocabulary, Garvey weaponized or utilized the vocabulary of Irish nationalism to support his cause. Most famously, he renamed the base of the UNIA in New York, Liberty Hall, in honor of the Irish Citizen Army. That was in 1919. He declared himself provisional president of Africa, again, explicitly referring to Eamon de Valera's use of the term provisional president of the Irish Republic. And even, for example, in 1919, the UNIA declared that they should inaugurate a convention of the Negro peoples of the world. And this was issued, the statement was issued 1 week after the Third Irish Race Convention in Philadelphia in February of 1919. So there's an appropriation of Irish nationalism by Marcus Garvey, the UNIA, in search of a contemporaneous Pan-African ideal. But the key thing here is that this is comparative. So while Marcus Garvey sent letters of congratulations to Eamon de Valera, to Arthur Griffith following the passage of the treaty, there were no transnational connections per se. They were observing and adopting those vocabularies somewhat from a distance. So I think comparison is very useful because it was contemporaneous and it was seen to be advantageous to anti-colonial nationalists, but it did not necessarily equate to a synchronous movement of peoples. There was not necessarily a direct connection. The second way in which we can think about this period of revolutions in the plural is transnational. And by that, I mean direct connections between different anti-colonial or anti-imperial groups. And in this case, I think the best example is that of Egypt. And in many ways, we need, I think, scholars to think about spaces, especially cities in which these kind of connections were developed. So we're not thinking necessarily about Ireland or about Egypt, but about cities like Berlin, Paris, London, where those activists and movements operated side by side and very much in collaboration. So, for example, in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference, Sean T. O'Kelly and George Gavin Duffy, the representatives of Dáil Éireann, supported the Egyptian Waft movement, who also sought independence from the British Empire at the Peace Conference. They met with them in hotels, they reviewed their documents, they co-wrote letters to American President Woodrow Wilson. And you can see this kind of very literary collaboration ongoing in 1921, even at the height of the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations, whereby even the treaty delegation led by Michael Collins was approached by the Egyptian delegation, which had negotiated with London about a year earlier. And there was an offer of exchange of documents in support of the negotiations. So this is a transnational connection, which is very literary, very intimate, very personal, and which takes place in these kind of cosmopolitan thought zones of London, Paris, Berlin, and otherwise. And the third and final point that I'd like to raise to kind of, I suppose, begin the conversation is that of the international lens by which we might be able to evaluate this colonial moment or anti-colonial moment. And by that, I mean the records and the viewpoints of governments and international organizations, how they perceived the Irish revolutionary movement and others. And you can see this most particularly in the official minutes and memoranda of government ministers and how they equated the Irish revolutionaries with other anti-colonial movements. Sometimes accurately, so they documented the connections with Egyptians that I've mentioned, but also equating Irish nationalists with other revolutionary movements with the view to weaponizing or delegitimizing their political prerogatives. So very often they would equate the Irish Revolution, for example, with Bolshevism, with the view to kind of delegitimizing the political aspects of the Irish revolutionary movement. And this idea of Sinn Féin Bolshevism, that hyphenated term, would become quite widely used in publications of the British government of this time. And you can see this many memoranda. So there is this sense that on paper, again, as opposed to in reality, the anti-colonial, colonial evaluations of the Irish Revolution and of Irish revolutionaries was propagandistic and was, I suppose, driven by the need to stabilize the imperial polity. So there are many more points which I'm sure we'll get to over the course of this very interesting and timely discussion, but I'm going to pass the floor over now to Liz for her opening statements. Thank you.
Thanks, Darragh. Over to you, Liz.
Thanks a million, Mike, and thanks a million, Darragh. I have to follow on from you now. And I would just like to say a huge thank you to Joanna, Claire, Bill, and everyone who's organised in setting up today's events and all the events. It is trying, to say the least, doing it all online, so fair play, and I'm delighted to take part in it. I suppose where I'm sort of really interested in is the similarities between the Irish Revolution and the revolutions that happen in other countries, and how we have those direct links. Now, Darragh has talked about, those connections, either indirectly and directly, but through the physical sort of medium of people. And when you look at the world today, we think that it's so small. We don't think 100 years ago that, communications and so on, word could travel around the world very quickly. And it did, thanks to the movement of people, but also thanks to the international press. And there's great examples of this with the Irish Revolution and how it the word was spread about this through people and through the international press. So very, very importantly in this were women. Irish women, either Anglo-Irish women or actually Irish women. And a couple of examples that I will give you, two key figures, especially when it comes to India, and I'm very much interested in India at the moment. You have Annie Besant and you have Margaret Cousins. And these two women were really involved in pursuing the cause for Indian independence. They'd been activists in Ireland. Margaret Cousins was a member of the Irish Women's Franchise League alongside Hannah Sheehy Skeffington. Her husband, James Cousins, he was an editor of their newspaper. But she and James moved to India in 1915. With Annie Besant, she was in India since 1898, and she was involved in the Indian National Congress, but also she was one of the key players or one of the early movers in the Indian Home Rule movement. So you have these direct connections between Ireland and India. And then you have women like Maud Gonne, who, while in Paris in 1908, she was actually meeting with Indian nationalists, but they had met years earlier in London. One of the people that she was involved with was Madame Kama, and she'd be like the Indian Maud Gonne, whereas Maud Gonne was inspired to be politically active with the land war in Ireland. You have Madame Kama being inspired by the plague in Bombay. So women becoming politically active because of events that affected, ordinary people, and them choosing to actually try to make a difference and dedicating their lives to that pursuit. But then nationalism comes into that as well. Then you've got Charlotte Despard, who was just a force to be reckoned with. And although of Anglo-Irish descent, she is such a complex figure. Her brother was Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Lord French, who really, at the height of the Irish Revolution, was determined to crush the IRA. They tried to assassinate him a number of times, and every time they failed. But she's involved with a lot of these women in the creation of the Indian-Irish, I'll get the name of that, I have it here, Indian-Irish Independence League in 1932. Another woman, Molly Woods, and she is in the thick of it in the Irish Revolution. Like, she's one of Collins's key figures in terms of providing information, gathering intelligence on the British agents that were then shot on Bloody Sunday in November 1920. She was pushed in safe houses for the IRA. Her daughter married an Indian, so you have direct connections there. So letters, information was passing directly through these people. But then propaganda, in terms of the Irish Revolution, it wasn't just a military campaign, it's a propaganda war as well. And you have Indian newspapers reporting on the Easter Rising. You have a Polish journalist reporting on the Easter Rising. You have all of these newspapers reporting on events, what happened in Ireland. And a key moment is, of course, the hunger strike of Terence McSweeney in October 1920, when he died after 75 days on hunger strike. And when we think of who was actually in London, Darragh talks about, London and these cities, not the actual cities of the countries that were rebelling, but Berlin, Paris, London, being conduits of where these people from those countries actually went to. You've got Ho Chi Minh in London at the time of Terence McSweeney's hunger strike, and they're witnessing all of these events and the international attention that brought, and then the impact that has internationally, especially after with the death of Terence McSweeney. You have Irish American dock workers going on strike in New York. You have Marcus Garvey encouraging his members to support the strikers. So you have all of these connections. So the world really wasn't a massive place 100 years ago. And then you have later on, in the 1920s and the 30s, the memoirs written by Irish revolutionaries being translated into all of these different languages. And the key one would be Dan Breen's My Fight for Irish Freedom, translated into 4 languages, including Hindi, Burmese, and Tamil. And a lot of those revolutionaries that took part, the people that took part in those revolutions to rebel against their oppressors, they basically used Dan Breen's book, My Fight for Irish Freedom, as a training manual. The book was banned in certain countries. So I suppose what I'm amazed by is that we think Ireland as this small little country that really nobody took notice of, but as we have seen, a lot of people took notice of Ireland at that time, especially those who were suffering similar fates to Ireland. And the Paris Peace Conference is a watershed moment for many countries who are seeking independence. Unfortunately, for those who were under the rule of the victors, independence wasn't on the cards for them. For those who were under the rule of those who lost, they did get some level of independence. So there's a huge difference there, which then inspires people from those countries like Egypt, Palestine, and so on to reject that form, a limited form of self-government, and want complete independence. And then there's another point that I would make in relation to sort of personalities. We also have to look at, people who had served in Ireland or had connections to Ireland and Palestine and India and so on. And Winston Churchill would be a key figure, Secretary of State of the colonies at that time. And I suppose one thing that that has now been discussed and is talked about because of the centenary of the War of Independence here, the role of the auxiliaries during the War of Independence. And when Ireland did become the Free State, when we got our limited independence for 26 counties, that unit was disbanded, but where they went to next, of course, was Palestine. The fact of the matter was that they didn't do necessarily what they had done in Ireland in terms of the reprisals. It seems they learned a little bit from the bad publicity that was created because of their activities in Ireland. But you have all of these little connections, huge connections that bring all of these countries together. Not only had they got that common goal of trying to get their independence, but you have all those threads as well then through people, through the press, and it is just fascinating to see all of those connections emerging.
Thanks very much. Very interesting kind of overviews of the connections that there were, and very, very interesting to get them spelt out in that kind of way. I suppose 2 things strike me immediately. One is how you focused on the important place of the kind of melting pots of the imperial centres, the metropolitan cities of London and Paris and Berlin, and how those were places that the colonies looked to, possibly to try and get influence, to try and change policy, to try and make connections, as you say. But then you have this kind of the setup of the difference between the metropolis and the province, and how it was very important for the colonies to throw off that kind of feeling of being, you know, like the junior partner, and to assert themselves as proper countries in their own right. And that kind of psychological metamorphosis is really quite important. Be interested to hear if you have any thoughts on that. The other thing, of course, is that as you know, what you've both outlined is the connections from below. In other words, the people trying to throw off the imperial yoke, and there was also the learning and the transference happening from above. And one thing that always struck me as remarkable was the fact that Ireland was partitioned was seen as a success by the British Empire. And that's why they've done it in so many other places and made such a mess of the world as they were leaving various parts of their empire. And so it's important to kind of see those as well. The final thing I'd maybe just throw in at this point, I'd be interested for any thoughts you have. In the last year or so, there have been two very important books or sets of books published looking at Ireland in a colonial context. For the first for quite a number of years, that's our own Bill Rowston's, along with Robbie McVeigh, has just published a book taking that perspective. And then Brendan O'Leary has published a three-part examination of Ireland in the colonial context. There's also the question of the President's Initiative, trying to look at the colonial history of Ireland. Is there a sense in which we're maybe finally recognizing that we've moved beyond the revisionist period, which tried to kind of undermine that understanding of Irish history, and that we can now reclaim, in the way that both of you are doing, the kind of the real anti-colonialist framework for Irish history that maybe has been people have tried to move away from over the last 20 years or so? Darragh, I don't know if you want to.
I'm quite happy to kind of speak to some of those. I mean, you've offered a real rich tableau of kind of areas of exploration, Mike, and I'm kind of keen to pick up on as many as I can, but obviously we'll see how the discussion goes. I think you're absolutely correct that there are almost certain paradoxes within this kind of imperial or anti-colonial framework, which we've been outlining, and Liz has done a terrific job in detailing and delineating some of those kind of threads. And the kind of the spatial issues that you've kind of alluded to, I think, are very central to that kind of paradox. So yes, in London, 1919, London was at the height of empire in terms of the territorial expanse of the British Empire. It reached its zenith in 1919 after the Paris Peace Conference, and yet those same spaces, metropolitan spaces, London itself, offered a site of resistance for not only Irish nationalists, but Egyptians, Burmese, Indians, and others. So I think those spaces are really important areas by which we can kind of unpack this kind of conundrum that is the kind of anti-colonial experience, certainly after the First World War. And I'm also intrigued by your kind of discussion of kind of metropole versus kind of periphery, or metropole versus province, is I think how you framed it. I think that strikes to the very heart of even what historians are increasingly trying to do, really, because I think before certainly this commemorative decade, there's always been this kind of, well, in my view, a kind of a false paradigm of, global versus local history. Transnational versus national history, that you can only be one, or that one framework is appropriate. Whereas, as you kind of alluded to, Irish nationalists were both local and international. Even if they were, sitting at their desk, like Michael Collins is a very case in point, during the War of Independence, cycling around Dublin disguised in his kind of, office clerk's kind of uniform or whatever. He was writing to people all across the world. He was well versed on international developments. I've read letters where he talks about Einstein's theory of relativity, for example. So he's reading widely. He's reading the newspapers, as Liz suggests, and yet he never leaves Dublin before the treaty negotiations. So he's someone who kind of epitomizes this idea of both local, national, and international all at the same time. Elke Boimer talks about this idea of virtual cosmopolitanism, whereby, and that term virtual is often has a 21st century connotation in terms of, the internet and so on. But actually at the time, as Liz, exactly, as Liz alluded to, people in local areas were reading newspapers about events happening around the world and making the connections in their minds about how that changed their lives. And I think some of those tensions within the historiography have been settled over the course of this decade of commemorations, to the point where I suppose in a post-revisionist space, we're thinking about kind of how opposites attract. We're thinking about how those tensions can sit side by side with each other. And I think another aspect of all this that we shouldn't forget is that, of course, that Ireland had an imperial engagement which was derived from power. In diaspora centres, for example, Irish, communities were at once Irish, Australian, for example, served in the imperial armed forces. So there are kind of multiple categories of identity, depending where you were in the world and when. So it's a very difficult and very layered subject, and I think something that we should continue to discuss at events such as this going forward. But interested to hear Liz's thoughts as well.
Yeah, in terms of the whole revisionist arguments and so on, the decade of centenaries, which, like in my personal experience, has been amazing, because it has given the ordinary people, for want of a better word, sort of ownership of the history. They're taking it back. They want to know. They want to discover the stories themselves. And thanks to the release of records, new records from military archives and so on, like they're digitizing all of these records and they're making them freely accessible. And it's opened it all up. And there's a lot of discussion. And I think one of the really important moments was the 1916 centenary commemorations, which were very different to those of 1966. And it was the, two generations sort of removed, and people began to realize that we ourselves have very complicated history. People had got relatives that served in the British Army while they were also members of the Irish Volunteers. So the people began to go, okay, this is complicated. Let's understand, not judge, let's understand it. And I think that was giving them the power to take back the ownership, rather than it just being sort of dictated to them. They want to discover, they want to explore, and they're armed with those tools to do that. And in terms of when you just look at those connections again, it's always going back to those connections between Ireland and the other colonies. Darragh just said it there, there were Irish that were actually, working for the empire in India, and again, that complicates the history as well. But if you look at the relationship between India and Ireland, they do tend to be more, supportive of that common struggle, that they were both colonies and they were both oppressed. One thing, there's one point that I really would love to make, and it is the press. And again, Darragh talked about it with the newspapers, that people were reading of events in Ireland that happened abroad and vice versa. And you have the event of the massacre, the Amritsar. Now, that happens in 1919. General Dwyer orders the troops to fire on a peaceful, what's the word I'm looking for? People it was a holiday, a festival or a religious holiday, and people had gathered, but the meetings had been, I think, proclaimed. And there was one entrance into this particular area, and the troops opened fire, and there was a massacre. And the scores of people were wounded. There were hundreds killed. But then a year later, you have the events on Bloody Sunday, where after the assassinations took place, where Collins sent out his men to assassinate the British agents, you then have the British forces, including the auxiliaries, that go out to the football match at Croke Park and open fire on the crowds. Now, the newspapers report that in India as Ireland's Amritsar. So you have those connections. So again, as Darragh said, it is people across the world who are in similar positions, reading about events that are quite similar to something that happened in their country a year or so before. But yeah, that would be just two of the points I'd make there.
And of course, Darragh was himself Irish, wasn't he?
This is it. And then you have the Governor General, I think, O'Dwyer as well. And I would a plug for a book, if I can. Patient Assassin by Anissa Anand is an amazing read on that whole event and those connections and so on. And you see again the similarities and taken inspiration from Ireland, because when you look at Bloody Sunday, when it did happen in 1920, the fact that Collins' men went out and tried to destroy the British Secret Service, you then have the Indian nationalists, like the man who then goes and assassinates Dyer, taking that on board, because up to that point, it was probably believed that the British Empire was untouchable. It was the empire that the sun never set on. But for something like that to happen, it gave them a moment of hope, which then, revenge could be possible, freedom could be possible. And then it follows later in the late 1920s with him actually assassinating Dyer for what happened in Amritsar.
Yeah, slight correction. I was incorrect. Dyer was Anglo-Indian, educated in Ireland. O'Dwyer was Irish. So that's me being incorrect and being corrected. Any reaction to all that, Darragh?
Yes, there is a point I'd like to make, and I think it was kind of sparked in part by what Liz was saying, which I thought was very instructive about this kind of, and it goes back to this idea about vocabularies of imperialism, which I kind of started to begin with, this idea of how, Bloody Sunday is Ireland's Amritsar and so on and so forth. And so that comparative label, whether it's used by Irish nationalists or British imperialists, is always very insightful. But one of the things I think we do need to talk about a little bit is the issue of race. And so, the Irish Revolution, was a bloody affair. It was violent. It was destructive, both in terms of actual deaths, but also psychological. We see that in the military pensions, for example, how the events of that period took their toll on the combatants and civilians alike. And I think that's another important aspect of all of the decade of commemorations, that the civilian experiences have come to the light a lot more. But at the same time, if you look at Ireland comparatively, the violence was not as excessive. If Ireland is seen as an exemplar of of the colonial or imperial experience, the violence inflicted by the British Crown Forces, for example, could not be seen to have been as excessive as other colonial states contemporaneously. Even if you look at, for example, I quoted the Ukrainian Revolution, which was contemporaneous with the Irish Revolution at the outset, and it's estimated that over 1 million deaths and injuries were incurred of Ukrainian forces in combat with the Bolshevik forces, for example, in that period between 1918 and 1923. So in Eastern Europe, for example, the deaths which were incurred in those kind of shatter zones of empire, which is the term that's often used, were far in excess of those experienced in Ireland. Similarly, in terms of intensity, you have, for example, in Korea and China, you have major movements, for example, the May 4th movement, which sought, again, parallel to developments in Ireland, to overcome Japanese rule in both their cases. And again, you have real strict impositions of martial law on the part of the Japanese authorities at the time against both the Chinese and the Koreans, and deaths far outweighing those of the Irish experience. So there is kind of I think, a tension there in terms of Ireland. It was, in some respects, a victim of, or perceived to be a victim of, British colonialism. Certainly Republicans would argue that. But at the same time, we need to kind of counterweigh or give proportion to how imperialism was used around the world. And to a certain extent, there was an element of white privilege on the part of Ireland. So Churchill, whose name was referenced earlier, I think in some of his letters talks about how, British martial law could not be used as freely and as unilaterally as it could in other places around the world, such as Egypt and so on. So we do need to be mindful of the fact that Ireland was a white nation, it was a European nation, and Irish nationalists used both of those ideas, that the fact that they were white, the fact that they were European, in support of their claims for self-determination. So there's definitely a racial tone to some of the discussions that were taking place at that time.
I suppose one of the things is that the repression, even though it maybe doesn't compare with some other parts of the world, it still calls up the memory of previous repressions, the famine as well, of course, and the United Irish time, which is probably more parallel to the kind of things you're talking about in Ukraine. I'm interested I suppose I'm an old lefty now at this stage, that the question of Ukraine, putting it in that kind of context, seems to me to be a new way of looking at it, because in the past I would always have seen that as part of the anti-revolutionary forces trying to put down the Bolshevik revolution in Russia as a whole, in the Soviet Union as a whole, rather than thinking more about the kind of the attempted movement for independence. Of course, that then did have repercussions during the Second World War, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, and the way in which Ukrainian nationalists seem to have, many of them seem to have collaborated with the Nazis in the first instance. So it's interesting the way in which nothing ever seems to stand still. The next phase of history always brings something more. It's an interesting kind of a perspective. And I must look at my Soviet history again to see that perspective.
That's fascinating. And if I may, to build on that, and then kind of goes back to Liz's point about kind of, making people aware of future publications. I've contributed an essay on Ireland and Ukrainian revolutions compared for a major 3-century volume on Ireland and Ukraine compared, which is going to be published in both English and Ukrainian. So that's forthcoming, I think, later this year or early next year. But one of the things which I learned from that experience of actually going to Kiev, I mean, that part of this period prior to COVID, if you can remember, of course, we were all able to travel and so on, but actually engaging with people directly, you definitely got a sense of how the historical memory of going back to Ukraine, to follow on your conversation, has been historical memory of the Ukrainian Revolution, for example, has been dictated to a certain extent by later 20th century colonial experiences. So, for example, many of the archival documents which were authored by Ukrainian activists were either destroyed by the Soviets in the mid-20th century or locked away for much of that century, or indeed kept in Moscow, which was almost impossible to kind of access for many of those Ukrainian scholars. So, for example, in the last 20 years, with the fall of the Soviet Union and so on, much of the historiography has been about kind of of a nationalist reflection. This was the great Ukrainian War of Independence. And I think that's an important point to bear in mind, that memory is informed, if not inflected, by kind of imperial frameworks and imperial power inequalities as well in the later 20th century. And Liz referred to, for example, how fortunate we are in a way that in this decade of commemorations, we've had access to the Bureau of Military History, military service pensions, but internationally, histories are being written and remembered on account of imperial power inequalities, even to this day.
Liz, can I invite you in?
I just on the point there that Darragh made, like as in later 20th century revolutions, and again, although we're talking about the sort of immediate period of 1919 through to 1923, the influence of the Irish Revolution, it continued, and I'll just sort of a personal experience that I have. I did a talk in Mozambique in 2016 about the women of the Irish Revolution. And there was an exhibition that was traveling around the world. And I was very, very fortunate to do a talk at a college to former women revolutionaries, so women who had taken part in the revolution in Mozambique in the 1970s were there. And after the lecture was over, I was talking to them, and they were just talking to me about how they were inspired by Irish women revolutionaries like Helena Maloney, like Countess Markievicz, who had done this 50 years before. So way before these women, were politically active, but the stories of these Irish women revolutionaries translated across the globe and inspired them. And for me to meet these women and actually hear their stories, it was amazing, because to get in, to try and understand what would make someone, become part of a revolution and, be willing to die for this cause. It helped me understand, people from 100 years ago that I cannot interview. So it is not just immediate to that period. The influence of the Irish Revolution carried on throughout the 20th century.
That's interesting. I've got a personal link to that region myself. I used to work with former IRA prisoners who would talk about their experiences in Long Kesh, like during their imprisonment. And one of the things that they did was that they developed documents for their own purposes for self-education. And as a way of hiding it from the authorities, they called it the Frelimo document, directly connected to the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique. And that was the way in which they kind of manifested their respect for that revolution, but also hid their documents from the authorities, or the import of their document from the authorities. I think it's the other thing, of course, is that it's all these matters are kind of reflected in every year when Sinn Féin would have their Ardèche. There would always be fraternal delegates from Palestine, from Cuba, and from any other kind of timely, like anti-colonial struggle, as a way of kind of indicating their solidarity with those groups. I mean, it has to be said as well that Ireland has such a strong history of supporting. Thinking of the East Timor struggle, there was great support in Ireland amongst very ordinary people, shall we say, as well as politicians. And of course, the anti-apartheid struggle was very, very well supported. So that kind of solidarity with the developing world, I think, is an important part of Irish kind of political identity. Darragh, any other thoughts that you'd like to contribute?
Well, I think that was a really interesting example that you gave in terms of those you might call microhistories, those kind of individual acts, which, and perhaps because they're not public, they're probably more resonant for that these are people who are, acting almost not necessarily in a script-like manner, but, thinking and evoking, these kind of anti-colonial actions which are taking place thousands of miles away and in support or in advocacy of people who they may never meet, and so there's an authenticity, I think, which underlines many of these actions, both in the early 20th century and again in the later 20th century. Another aspect which I thought might be worth just drawing out a little bit is the diaspora, of course, and as I kind of alluded to earlier, I think diaspora complicates the narrative of the Irish Revolution in many ways. To date, as historians of on the island, we write island stories, whether they're partitionist or all island, they are about the people of this island, and they focus geographically on that space. Whereas I think if we think about a greater Ireland or a global Ireland, the issue of empire becomes again more complicated, and Ireland becomes decentered. And the question is, going forward, and this might be something that perhaps President Higgins' commemorations will discover or discuss in further detail, is how do we integrate this global Irish diaspora into this story? Because I think there is a problem going forward that, for example, in the decade of commemorations, we are entering into the period of treaty and partition, evidently already, civil war. And so I would be concerned that the debates become more narrow more inclusive or exclusive in the sense of, dealing with the island as opposed to the Greater Ireland experience. And in that regard, that Irish migrants become doubly marginalised. So they're marginalised when they're forced to leave the island for economic opportunities or what have you, but also they're marginalised from the history books. And I think some of the discussions might profitably take into consideration, as we mentioned already, in places like Australia and Canada, where their experiences of empire were perhaps more benign, in the sense of they got the advantages of empire and being part of the Commonwealth and so on. And some of those issues were evoked even during the treaty debates, which we haven't necessarily touched on. When Collins and Griffith are trying to sell the treaty, they're invoking Canada. They're saying we will be have the same status as Canada. Jan Smuts, who's the Prime Minister of South Africa, was very supportive of this treaty. He talked to De Valera about, coming into this imperial family. And even in 1920s and 1930s with, the Westminster, Statute of Westminster and so on, we see that Ireland worked with other parts of the empire, with the other dominions rather, to kind of give Ireland greater constitutional status within the broader frameworks of empire. So there were diaspora-led experience of empire, which we could think about. And then, constructive engagements with empire, even after the treaty is signed, I think need to be thought about. And perhaps there was an element of separation in the 1920s Ireland. There wasn't as much of an emphasis on the kind of anti-colonial experience, with Indian and Egyptian nationalists, that they were more concerned, the Free State leadership, with constructive politics in terms of empire. So I'm interested to hear Liz's thoughts.
Survival, of course, as well, I suppose, in the face of the Civil War. Yeah. Liz, any thoughts you want to share?
That's interesting what Darragh says there about in the 20s, you have this sort of maybe a sort of drawn back of the sort of connections with the other colonies. And that then seems to change in 1932 when Eamon de Valera and Fianna Fáil win the general election. So you have the provision, the Cumann na Gael party obviously being in power at that period. And, if you look at what happened in Ireland at that time, everything that was sort of fought for in the 1916 proclamation is very quickly, really brought back, especially when it comes to women. And it can be seen then in the international context as well. But in terms of Eamon de Valera and maybe reigniting those connections, certainly with India, because you have the visits to Ireland of Patel, and I'll forgive my pronunciations, it is Yannick, they come to Ireland in 1932, and you have those meetings with Charlotte Despard and Maud Gonne and so on, and they attend the unveiling of the statue of Countess Markievicz in Stephen's Green Park in 1932. So you have those connections being, or those relationships being reignited, it seems, when De Valera enters power in 1932. And those relationships then continue throughout that whole period when India then gets its independence. And I would just say one thing, and it was just a point that was made earlier on in terms of race. Although the Irish experience was terrible in terms of the way we were treated, you have actually in 1800, I'm just going to quote it here, Misra Abu Talib Khan, an Indian, he visited Ireland in 1800, and he said that the peasants of India are rich compared to the peasants in Ireland. So from an Indian's point of view, the Irish peasants were treated worse than those in India. But in terms of the actual experience, we were a training ground for everything that happened in the empire. But because of the colour of our skin, stuff that they got away with, that Britain got away with in India, they would not have gotten away with here. And we did get off lightly, although it was horrific, the famine and so on. All that experience is horrific to us personally. If we look at it in terms of the casualties, of the way, the violence, India, it was horrible, absolutely horrible. The way they were treated. Just another point to make there.
Thanks, Liz. We're approaching the end now. I'm just going to invite you, if there's any concluding comments you want to make, Darragh, in the last few minutes, and come back to you, Liz, and then I'll wrap us off.
Well, I think this has been a really thought-provoking and fruitful discussion. We've touched on a lot of issues, and I'm sure we could have gone another hour. I think to move forward, I think we need to think as a community of scholars, we need to think more deeply about this idea of the vocabulary of imperialism, how it was used 100 years ago, by whom, for what purpose, and how we as historians can use that productively in the next few years. I'd like to again accord with President Higgins in his discussion of how we commemorate. I think it's important to have different points of view in terms of the experiences of empire, and I think going forward, if more scholars from the global south and from other countries could be part of these conversations and going forward, I think that would be really, really helpful to understanding and placing the Irish Revolution in context. So my hope for the next 2 to 3 years, as we kind of delve into the deepest and most difficult parts of commemoration, is that we can still think internationally and that we can still place Ireland in its international context.
Thanks, Darragh. Liz, any concluding thoughts from you?
I just would like to say that amazing work has been done in this field of telling the Irish story, but then making those connections to the international, what was happening in the world at that time with other colonies. And I suppose it's shown that shared history. We talk about having a shared history on this island, but we actually have a shared history across the globe, be it through the diaspora and also the similarities of being a colony. And I think also that to help better understand the Irish Revolution, it is worth looking at the experiences of other countries, and scholars are doing, like Kate O'Malley, are doing fantastic work on this, and events like this are also bringing that conversation forward to people. So I would just say, just thanks a million for letting me be part of it today. And as Darragh said, we could talk probably for 3 hours about this, but it really is fascinating, and we're scratching the surface with these stories, but there's a lot to discover. So I would encourage people to go out and discover more, discover what you can.
Great, Liz, thank you very much. And in conclusion, I suppose I'm duty bound to say that though white people had a benign experience of imperialism in Canada and Australia, of course, the indigenous people did not, and it's always important to remember that. And then finally, just to show some of the ambiguities, I was very, very struck by reading a book by Pankaj Mishra, in which he talked about the impact in the developing world, if you call it that, of the defeat of Russia by the Japanese in 1905. It was the first big defeat of an empire, and throughout the imperial world, people were galvanized by that, thinking, well, they're not invulnerable. They can be defeated, and it was such an important lesson in other parts of Asia to see that there was a possibility of mobilizing to get rid of the colonial rulers. I suppose that's something that Ireland shares in and managed to make that transition partly. There are many who say that it's unfinished business, but it's been a very illuminating talk. I'd like to thank Darragh and Liz for their contributions, and also, as they did at the start, thanking the people who made this possible, Joanna McMinn, Claire Hackett, and Bill Roston, as well as the organisers in the Féile. And we look forward to continuing the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mike.